going to get started, Greg. All right. Before we do, terrific. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Great to see you. Thank you very much for being here. We might still have others trickling in. If we do, we'll just go with the flow. So it's a fairly relaxed event. Thanks very much for being here for this. Graham, I'm just doing a quick sound check. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Wonderful, thank you. This, of course, is part of New South Wales History Council History Week. There are many, many events, including ones tonight in other parts of the city and no doubt the state. And it's organised by a research group that I'm part of, and we've got a couple of other research group members down here, Eloise and Samantha. And it's called Reminding Histories, as in reminding and minding or looking after histories of mental health. And it's a project funded by the Australian Research Council about community mental health in Australia. And so this event is part of that research group promoting its research to wider audiences. It's part of History Week, and it's also in conjunction with Inner West Council Libraries. So thank you very much to the libraries for helping us a great deal tonight to facilitate this event. I'd like to acknowledge formally the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation, right here in the heart of Eora Nation people's lands that we've ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course all those Aboriginal future leaders and those in our midst tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge people with lived experience of mental illness or mental health experiences, and I'm sure that we're all well aware of the way mental illness touches everybody's life at some point through family or personal connections. So this is a discussion about the development of community mental health with people in communities who had their hands on community mental health services and the creation of new forms of mental health support. And in preparation for this event, Hans Pols at the University of Sydney and I'm Kathy Holborn, by the way, I'm at the University of Newcastle. We were talking with Martina and Graham, our special guests, and I got a real sense of the passion and enthusiasm that they bring to this as people who had their hands on community mental health. And starting in the late 1970s, there were several initiatives undertaken to provide mental health care in the community rather than in hospitals, mental health institutions. So as I said, I've been part of this research group, and the research is based at the University of Sydney with the University of Newcastle. And our research places emphasis on the experiences of people who worked in these community mental health settings, who created change, people like Martina and Graham, but also people who lived with mental illness or mental health conditions and who navigated those systems of care and models of treatment. And our values as a research group include making sure that we work with people who have lived experience of mental illness, and we also have involved a number of peer workers in mental health, a fantastic group of younger people who have been instrumental to this research. And of course, as we'll hear tonight, mental health nurses played a central role in these past decades, in these events and through change. And tonight I'm talking to two pioneering nurses in the field of mental health care. So what we want to do as part of this discussion is share and promote their work and the work of other people who are at the heart of making change in mental health. And we want to link that to our present context and to understand the significance of their work, because we know that mental health care in our present is still undergoing a lot of change. There are lots of questions we all have, and there are lots of problems that we understand and know about. So these things are very current as well as being about the past. So we have two wonderful guests in conversation. I'm going to open with some questions and then interact with you, the audience, at Martina's request really. So Martina really wanted this to be interactive. We do have Graham on Zoom, and I'll introduce each of them properly in a minute, but that means that we might just have to be careful of the sound us in the room, we have Darnley-Pentes, who is involved in a pioneering community mental health initiative in Waverley, Lara, and as part of the Health Commission of New South Wales. And she was the director of the Bondi Junction Community Health Centre from 1976 to 1986. Welcome, Martina. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And joining us on Zoom is Graham Curry, who registered as a psychiatric nurse in 1980. He worked in hospitals, communities, residential care facilities, and in private practice. He's taught nursing, and he was active in Sydney and Brisbane in advocacy, counselling, and community development. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to start then by just asking each of our wonderful guests by talking just for a few minutes each about what you think is community mental health. What does it mean to you, and how would you describe it? And I might start with Martina and then go to Graham. Martina, what does community mental health mean to you?
I think community mental health is about the whole person in their whole social context. I think it's a very complex thing. Mostly up until I did mental health nursing, it was something that happened in an institution. I'd like to start, that can't be a full answer, but I think if I tell you where I started from, you would see it unfold. So in 1966, I studied mental health nursing at Broughton Hall Psychiatric Clinic, and at the same time, there were a lot of things happening at the same time. It was a melting pot and a time of society turning over. David Madison was the professor of psychiatry at the time, and he had just been to America, where he spent some time with Kaplan, who was talking about community mental health and preventive psychiatry, not community psychiatry, community prevention. Okay, that was a new idea, because up until then, psychiatry was reactive to an illness, and it was using more or less a medical model. So David came back to and set up an educational unit on site at Broughton Hall, and I guess he got talking to Madison, David Madison, and he felt inspired to look into this a bit more deeply, and so that he set up a pilot program into community mental health in Canterbury municipality, because Canterbury municipality had the most average demographic in Sydney. And look how that's changed. Everything changes. And so he also set up I suppose it was outreach really, more than community mental health, but it was a beginning. It was a pilot program where people were looking at how do we work with people instead of coming into hospital, they could be treated or worked with at home in their community. So now we're seeing some account being taken of the social context within which people found themselves. And one person that was on that team was Elizabeth Toe. She was a social worker, and she started she had a background of working with Ellie Jensen in the UK with the Richmond Fellowship and with young people as an alternative for them being hospitalised whenever they were having a life crisis. But what she did out in Canterbury Municipality at Punchbowl was work with single mothers who found themselves in a public housing, and she set up a community-based support group that did stuff like sharing school uniforms and talking to each other about the vicissitudes of being a single parent. And that was quite radical, really, in those days. And what she was actually doing and what we were actually doing was things that strengthened community, things that created community, rather than treat people for an illness by bringing them into hospital. Okay, so that was that little bit. And so I felt quite inspired by that. I went to the UK, worked with Thomas Lane's program at the Castle, and I was very impressed by how they didn't provide anything that the community could provide. If you needed a GP, you went to the GP in the community. They didn't bring services into what was the therapeutic community. That's a whole other story. But anyway, I felt inspired by that. When I came back to Australia, I got a job with the Crisis Centre in Crown Street. Now, the reason I've told you all that other stuff, besides getting overwhelmed by this growing group, was it brought me to a really important point. So here I was in this crisis centre with people coming in and picking up their antipsychotics and, you know, the usual thing. And then this guy turns up and he spins me this amazing story of of having schizophrenia and being really disturbed, except he wasn't really disturbed. And I thought, that is really strange. So I got his story. In the summertime, he would go to Tasmania. In the wintertime, he would migrate up to Queensland. And apparently he was part of almost a movement of people with mental illnesses who did that. And so I asked him the most important question of what changed my career. And that was, if you didn't have to be mad, what would really help you? He said, well, I need a roof over my head, somewhere to sleep, and I need access to food. So there was no schizophrenia there was no psychosis there. His problem was psychosocial. His problem was to do with social determinants. So I'm thinking, we've really missed something here. You know, this has got to lead somewhere. At the same time as this, the Division of Health Services Research and Planning was beginning to launch a project into developing what became known as the Rainbow Books. And it was going to be a blueprint for setting up community health services. They were heady days. We had Whitlam funding being thrown at everything that looked half good, and this was one of them. So I fronted up. I felt inspired by this young man. I wish I knew who he was and what happened to him. But anyway, and Tony Adams was the director of that unit. And Bill Barclay, I was talking with my former colleague over here, was Commissioner for Personal Health Services, and he was really interested in, he had something in mind that he wasn't really sharing with us, but he said, I need to know how many unnecessary psychiatric admissions we're having. You can see where this is going. Anyway, I was working with Laurie Young, and we said to him, look, we can't tell you that because that's a value judgment, but what we can tell you is we can have a look at what the criteria are for psychiatric hospitalisation. And so we embarked on a bit of a study looking at that, the criteria for admission. And we went round to all of the psychiatric institutions in the state, attended conferences where we had captive psychiatrists we could talk to. And I said to Laurie, you know, we should be also interviewing some of the patients. He said, no, we can't do that. And I said, well, they know something. They know why they came in. And he said, no, we can't do that. And I said, why not? He said, because that would be too unreliable. The data would be unreliable and it would skew the results. So I hung in there. I think I was heavily pregnant with my second child, so I had real stamina. So I hung in there and he said, okay, but we're going to publish that separately. Anyway, the long and the short of it was, to our astonishment, if it was Friday night and it was raining and the support network around the individual was fatigued, that person was more likely to be admitted. And none of those things are to do with psychiatric symptomatology. It was everything to do with social determinants, with community support, with so, you know, did we really have to deal with that in an institutional setting? So then we had the Richmond report coming after that, that further cemented that view, and we saw the process of deinstitutionalisation. Anyway, I participated in the development of the Rainbow Books, and then now we're getting towards 1976, and I put my hand up for going into the community to see if we could make that model float. So I managed to tough it out for 10 years, and then the doctors got hold of us. I said, we can't have integrated services out there on the ground, we need them vertically integrated into the hospital situation. All right, okay, so that brings me up to Bondi Junction. I think I took too long.
Thank you so much. What a really rich opening. You've covered a lot of ground, and you started by talking about community mental health meaning to you, the whole person, so the person in their community, and you talked about social determinants of health broadly conceived, so the way in which people are part of a wider setting. They might be impoverished, they might be hungry, they might need a home, and therefore the services are starting to really approach that kind of question of social services in general, which is really, really interesting, I think. And there were some other things in there too we might come back to, particularly, I think, this question of patients and their view, their experiences. So, yeah. Now, we've got Graham, though. We did have Graham. We did have Graham.
I'm still here.
Ah, you're here. Okay, thank you. All right, Graham. So, Graham, what does community mental health mean to you? We've lost your face, though. You might have bumped your camera. I'm not sure, but
No, my camera's still on. I'm still here. I can see myself. But
okay, that's all right. We can hear you really well. So, why don't you start
can people
talking?
see me as well, or not really?
Just start.
No.
Start. start
Just
talking.
seeing me as part of the presentation, really, but
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry.
but anyway, but I'll speak.
Please do.
First of all, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia in whose lands we are privileged to live and to work and to be still and to be attentive and to hear and to listen and to be. And we honour their elders past, present and future. And so in terms of what community health means to me, it's very much, and I do acknowledge here the work I did in particular with Robin Shields and the other people we worked with on the Aboriginal Mental Health Project at Ku-ring-gai UTS back in the early 90s, where we were involved in, and I was working under the supervision and with the guidance of Robin as an Aboriginal nurse and the Aboriginal community that she was working for and with. And one of the most fundamental concepts is the idea of social and emotional well-being rather than mental health or mental illness. So social and emotional well-being, which really includes physical, social, psychological, spiritual, ecological, a whole dimension of being and being present and letting be and being attentive, including to the environment, physical, spiritual, natural world, social world, internal, psychological, however we might describe our internal world, and the political dynamics surrounding all that as well. And so I think, for example, that, and I've been doing some work with this at the moment with another group I'm involved with, is exploring the statement from the heart and how we truly listen to the voice of the ancient continuing inhabitants of this land, from the voice in the wilderness and also in terms of the Torres Strait, the voice from the depths of the ocean, of the sea. So that's my context for community mental health. And it provides a model. When we were working on the Aboriginal Mental Health Program, what I realised is that if we could do all of mental health community work the way that we were designing the program with the Aboriginal community and leaders, that would be a better way to go than the way that we've done it in the dominant white European culture in this country, because it is more connected, it is more holistic, it is more integrative, and it's where we are all there together as equals in our deep humanity. And certainly that related to a whole stack of other stuff earlier in my career, even before I knew I had a career, is that at the age of 21, that was in 1970, a few years ago now, I became an Anglican Franciscan brother in Brisbane, and I spent 3.5 years in the community in Brisbane and Papua New Guinea, mainly in Brisbane. And in Brisbane, we primarily lived and worked we had a house just on the edge of Brisbane, our main house, where we had about 14 brothers, and we had room for 14 people as guests to live with us in our house. And most of the guests in our house were people who had been in the psychiatric hospital at some point, or had been in prison, or both, or had been homeless. And they lived with us, and we ate at the same meals every day together as a family, as a community, and our guests, the people who lived with us, our friends, worked with us in the kitchen or on the farm or whatever. And so that was my experience of, this is well before I became a psychiatric nurse. I had never thought about being a psychiatric nurse, and I did not even see the people that were living. These were guests in our house, friends who we shared our life with and lived our everyday life with. And that was at the age of 21, 1970. And in the 4 years before I joined the community, from the age of 17, when I was doing my first degree at Sydney University, I used to go and spend some time with the brothers and with the guests there at Brookfield near Brisbane in my university holidays over those 4 years before I joined. And that included sleeping in the same dormitory as the people that I was going to share those several years of my life with later on as well. And so it was quite interesting that when I left the community, because I became an atheist for a while, and so I wasn't quite able to continue in the community although I wanted to, and the brothers wanted me to, but it was a bit tricky. And I completed my second degree, and then I went to live in Melbourne for a while, and I needed a job. And I just happened to be living in a house with three people who were psychiatric nurses. And they said to me, "Oh, you'll get a job in the bin down the road." And so I went down the road to Royal Park Hospital, and I got a job as a ward assistant in the male and female lockup wards of Royal Park Hospital. And within a couple of days I thought, these people are my friends. These are the people I used to live with. And that inspired me. So when I came back to Sydney, I then went to Rozelle Hospital very soon after the amalgamation of Broughton Hall and Cullen Park, and said I wanted a job here to train as a psychiatric nurse, to work with people that I had, the kind of people that I was used to living with and spending my time with, whom I had never really seen as psychiatric patients or people with mental health problems or issues, but rather these were just people who, like me and you and everybody else, who are our friends, our guests, our colleagues, our people who any of us could be. And what was most interesting at that time is that I got the train from Brisbane, I got off the train, went to Drummoyne, went to the real estate agent, rented a unit in Drummoyne because it was between Rozelle and Gladesville hospitals to make sure I could get some work. I got the bus to Rozelle and got an interview to be a psychiatric nurse. They said, "Are you too qualified?" I already had 7 years academic qualifications behind me. And I said, "But I want to work with the people that I like working with." I convinced them to give me a job as a student nurse. I then went home to Granville, where my parents lived, and said to them, "I've now got a job as a psychiatric nurse at Rozelle. I've moved back to Sydney." And my parents were happy that I'd moved back to Sydney, but they were a bit concerned that I'd decided to become a psychiatric nurse. But then, most interestingly, my father told me something which he had never, ever hinted at before, that he had been a patient in Broughton Hall early in the Second World War. And it actually happened that I was working, the first ward I worked in was probably the ward that my father had been a patient in. and he was only there for a short time. It was related to depression after the end of a relationship he had with a girl that he'd hoped to marry, and that didn't work out, and he did have electroconvulsive therapy, etc. And so that really confirmed what didn't really need confirmation, is that any of us could be a so-called psychiatric patient. Any of us in the community can be, basically, we're all in this together. And community mental health is about building communities, creating communities, creating relationships with one another, respecting diversity and difference, and creating unity rather than uniformity within our diversity, to be able to advocate for one another, to emphasise our equality, and to be integrative in the way that we provide care, not so much for one another, but care with one another. And so later on, when I actually, after I completed my training at Roselle Bladesville, and then worked for several years teaching in the, and also worked in the acute admissions ward as a registered nurse for a time, and then was asked to teach at the School of Nursing for several years. And then Martina, who's here tonight, decided to headhunt me, and I left the School of Nursing and went and worked with Martina at this was in the end of 1983, early 84, worked with Martina and her team there at the Bondi Junction Community Health Centre, where we had a very integrative, holistic mental health, not mental health, health team of people providing health, and which was innovative in the sense that we had a baby health team, we had a generalist team which was mainly working with aged care. We had a drug and alcohol team, we had a health promotion team, we had a mental health team. I was on the mental health team, but it meant that if I was working with a mother with postpartum psychosis, I could work along with the baby health team. If I was working with an elderly person with dementia, I could work in collaboration with the generalist aged care team. And it was a wonderful way to run a service that really looked holistically and integratively at the way of delivering service. And politically, people didn't like that. People wanted to chop it all up, and it was destroyed at a later stage.
So Graham,
that moves into the politics enough.
That's fantastic. Can I jump in now? Because that's a great point.
Absolutely, that's just a beginning.
That's wonderful. There's so much to say. And Martina had kind of ended her part at Bondi Junction, and so we've arrived at the kind of meeting point now. So I wonder if both of you then, and this isn't in the prepared questions, I guess, we had those on standby, before we maybe ask the audience to interact a bit more. You both use the term inspired, and a lot of people who don't work ordinarily in these kinds of ways or in these kind of health communities don't necessarily understand what that might be like, to feel inspired by a new way of caring for people or with people and among people, and coming up with solutions in these what were radical kinds of concepts of mental health care. So I find it really interesting that you both use that word inspired. So could you both maybe just talk a little bit about working together at Bondi? I mean, what sorts of issues came up that challenged you or that confronted you in your work, Martina, in those days?
Well, it was a large team. We had 64, 65 staff across a number of service focuses. The challenge for me as the manager of that service was to develop a management structure that would deliver what we said we wanted to deliver. You know, like shit in, shit out. So we had to do better than that. So what sort of structures, the challenge was, what sort of structures are going to support, sorry, should I not say should? Going to support the objectives that we had as a service. So some of the shared values and ethics that we had were about collaboration, starting with the community where it was at, empowerment, strengthening community. We didn't use that word then, strengthening community. The sort of language we used in those days was community development, which is something that you do to people rather than with people. But we've moved on, you know, I mean, it was somewhere to start. We actually had a community development officer that transmogrified into health education further down the line. Something about what that model was offering, which was about connectedness and engagement and involving staff in decision making, in planning services, not separating responsibility and authority, but building something together. There was something about that that didn't make people further up the line very happy.
Right. Did people just walk in off the street, or did they need a referral? Right, okay.
They could.
Yeah, so that...
Can we ask a question? Did you guys, sorry.
No, go for it.
Did you guys, how did you come up with that integrated, did you guys come up with the integrated strategy of interdisciplinary teams? Or is it something you arrived at?
No,
or
it was based on the Rainbow Books, which was a blueprint for community health services. And one of the main objectives, this is just my call on it, was to keep people out of hospital.
Right.
So that they didn't ever get, enter a career of patienthood in the first place. But there should be enough resources in their community, in their family, within themselves, with a bit of support. If you walk beside them for a bit, they find their way back on track.
I think we've lost Graham, it looks like to me. Is that right? No, we're starting up again.
Sorry everyone.
It's okay.
It's all
Here we are. Hi, Graham.
Are you back with us, Graham?
You can see me now?
Yes, we're all good, We were just talking about the way in which the structures, tried to facilitate the kinds of work you wanted to do in this setting. And a question came about, was this your invention? Did you make it up? Did you want to keep going with that material?
Oh, well, I could just finish it off by saying, they were the guidelines, but we developed our own unique system in that place together. Like we had a management meeting every week, and each of those sub-teams that you've heard mentioned would send their elected representative. They weren't appointed by me. And if they weren't doing their job properly, their sub-team could pull them out and put somebody else in. So we made decisions together. The buck stopped with me, but further up the line. But so if things went wrong, it was my fault. But it was good training ground for people to to explore these new ways of doing things. And I just want to say one last thing, then I'll let you go back to Graham. I can remember with the generalist nurses who were physical nurses that visited people at home based on the Sydney home nursing model, I suspect. After about 9 months, and I thought that was a significant period of time, their representative came to me and said, look, we don't like this community health stuff. We want to be real nurses and go back and do real nursing in the hospitals. And so I said, okay, well, let's talk about it and see what's going on here. And it turned out, what they were struggling with was having to structure their own day, being responsible for their own time, nobody looking over their shoulder, having to know when to consult when they didn't have enough technical information to move forward. So, you know, it was all that anxiety stuff. Once they cracked that, they were right.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot about, you know, from your points of view as people immersed in this, but our audience members might have questions just as I did about, you know, how did it work? You know, do people wander in? So before I go to Graham, does anybody else have a question that you'd like to ask one of our speakers about what you know, is it clear to you how different this was? Many of you might be already experienced, of course, and might be working in these settings yourselves. So are there any thoughts or questions bubbling up? Yes.
Just sounds like it was quite more humanitarian. Like I know mental health has gone through lots of different phases and chapters and approaches over the decades. And I'm someone born in the 70s and have people with mental health issues in my family. And it just sounds like a nice approach in a way.
Okay. So a bit of feedback for you. It sounds humanitarian. It sounds like an approach that supported people. Thank you. Yeah. What about, I mean, this came up in our planning. What about if there was a problem or a situation that couldn't be resolved in a community mental health or a community setting? Graham, did you want to reflect on that? Did that happen in your experience?
Yeah, we probably go back a little bit to when I was working at Roselle Gladesville in the School of Nursing, which was based in the Gary Owen building at Roselle, but we were teaching the student nurses from both hospitals, both in psychiatric nursing as well as in what at that time was called mental retardation nursing, that we would now call intellectual disability nursing. And for a period of time, I was the vice president, one of the 3 vice presidents of the New South Wales Nurses Association, representing the School of Nursing, and very involved in the politics of that time. And it was the time of the Richmond Report and the attempts to begin systematically closing down both Gladesville and Roselle and other hospitals, and with the government and other people having a very big eye on the potential for real estate, which continues to be an issue 40 years later. And I was invited to be on a committee, and I went to the first meeting, which was being held in what I think even to recent times was in the ambulance training centre at Roselle that some people may be familiar with. So there was a room there and there were could have been 30 people who were on this committee, which I thought was a pretty obscene way of spending the department's money, to have all of our salaries with that many people in one committee. It seemed a bit crazy to me. But I did persist for a little while, and the government of the day, in its generosity, had allocated to us several millions of dollars for us to plan to spend. As far as I recall, there were no people with lived experience of mental health issues on the committee. It was all of us supposed professionals. And so as the meeting emerged, I thought, this is crazy. They've given us this many $1 million, and it might potentially, in the property market at that time, we could buy maybe 3 houses with that money and accommodate potentially maybe up to 15 people of all the people who were that were thinking about moving, and from the hospital to the so-called community, but there would be no money left for renovations to make the places livable. There would be no money left to have appropriate staffing and support services. And so before the meeting even ended, the meeting went up for about 2 hours or something, I resigned from the meeting because it was all just a bit of political government window dressing to make it look as if the government was doing something good about supposedly deinstitutionalising people and moving them into the community. But the kind of money that was being on offer was totally inadequate. So they were going to pull the pin on the funding for those people still living in the institutions and provide absolute inadequate funding and services for the people who they were hoping to move into the community. And there were obviously other ways I could have responded to that, and I probably went more into the politics and the advocacy side of matters, including representing the Nurses Association for New South Wales with the Premier, who was Neville Wran at that stage, and Laurie Verreton, who was the supposed health minister, who absolutely knew nothing about mental health and probably knew nothing about health at all. So that when I was at the meeting in the Premier's office, as the main spokesman for the Nurses Association on this particular occasion in the early 80s, related to the Richmond report, every question that I asked the Minister for Health, Laurie Verreton, he did not have a clue how to answer any of my questions. He knew nothing about his portfolio. If he had any sense as a minister, he would have got a senior public servant who knew something to come and speak on his behalf. It was interesting that Neville Wran intervened and was able to at least have some understanding of what I was talking about, because Neville Wran had been a junior lawyer during the Royal Commission into Callan Park in the 1960s, so he did know a little bit about the mental health. But that meeting came to a very sudden halt when it was the day that Neville Wran got the phone call and had to step down from the premiership for a time. But that was not my fault, although it would have been nice if it had been. Anyway, that's enough.
So Graham, you're talking there about, I was wanting to get at when community mental health doesn't necessarily work, because I think that's a controversial question that we should look at. But I'll move away from that now, and I just want to, but it's terrific because we also moved into another point we wanted to talk about, which is where you put your efforts, and you put your efforts into that political advocacy and in that, kind of trying to raise people's consciousness about what could work. I think that's fantastic and really important work. But I wonder if people have some questions before we start drawing to a close, because we've only got a little bit of time left. So, yes.
Just maybe expanding on what you were just saying. I mean, what is the option now or then for those few people that the community model doesn't work? Because I'm a general nurse, and I
Okay, well, after the deinstitutionalisation movement got into full swing, let's look at Roselle because it's just down the road. I don't know if I've got my figures right, but Graham can help me here. I think there was something like 2,500 people in that complex. It included a dairy farm and they grew their own food, and it was almost like a self-sustained community. Okay, so what they did with aged care, because a lot of older people there, they discharged them into aged care facilities or home, but mainly aged care facilities. And then they took people that they called mentally retarded, but we don't use that term any longer. They actually had a fantastic program where they set up community houses, and they had maybe about 5 people in each house, properly funded, properly supported, sometimes with, you know, in a range of people, either staff living in or attending. I don't think we can afford that system anymore, but anyway, they were discharged from there, and then they had people moved home. Anyway, what they ended up with, 2,500 beds, was something more like 120 beds at the end of that exercise, and they amalgamated Broughton Hall with Roselle, and that 120 beds eventually got transferred over to Concord. That's the history of it. But they reserved those beds for people that were the two thrusts. There are people that were not ever going to be able to live, and they're the people you're interested in the community again. And then there were people who just needed some time out, that would have a short admission, go home, or undergo some rehabilitation, go home. But the people who would never be able to live in the community again, there are very few of those people, which I find very interesting, because I think, you know, we get in early enough and competently enough these days for it not to come to that. But for those people for whom it was too late, they're a very small population now, and they're going to die in hospital.
Yeah.
That's their, you know, they used to call them the back wards.
Yeah, the country hospitals used to have the back 2 or 3 wards, 4-bed wards at the end, one for dementia patients and one for the...
But I think we're much better at delivering mental health care now, and so, you know, mental health care belongs everywhere, in ICU, in acute hospital admission, in baby health centres, in schools, with your neighbour. You know, it sort of doesn't come to that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really great and a really hopeful kind of point to make, because I was going to follow up for both of you and ask.
Well, Graham might have a different spin on it.
Yeah, you might too. I'll come back, but I was going to ask what you think the future for community mental health care is. We're having a funny time, aren't we? We've got doors.
Sorry, I didn't hear that last question.
That's okay. We just had a little door opening in the background.
No, I heard that, but
Yes.
before that.
Okay, Graham, did you have a response to the great question from the audience, which is...
Yep. Because I worked at I worked both at Gladesville and Roselle, and both hospitals, both Gladesville and Roselle. And by the time I probably worked there, which was a little bit later than Martina, I think Roselle was probably already down to about 1,000 when I first worked there, and Gladesville was about 1,000 patients as well, but that was still a very significant number of patients. And certainly I would go along with quite a bit of what Martina said. But I know what happened at Gladesville, for example, with some of what were called the psychogeriatric wards, where whole groups of patients patients without warning were loaded onto buses and taken off to be, I was going to use the word, dumped at nursing homes where the staff had no training in working with mental health patients. And within 12 months, a lot of those elderly people who had been many years in the psychiatric hospital had died. And I think that was a great tragedy because there was no real sort of gentle, sort of respectful transition to a new home for the people who were being moved. So it was like, somebody arriving at our house this evening and putting us all on a bus and taking us to live somewhere where we had no choice as to where we were going to live, away from everything familiar. And I think that was a great, great, great tragedy and still pains me to this very day. Certainly I think deinstitutionalisation is a good idea, but at the same time for example, what was interesting comparing working at both Rozelle and Gladesville is I worked at Rozelle first, then moved across to Gladesville, and then came back to be in the School of Nursing at Rozelle, but still had contact with Gladesville because of when I was working at the School of Nursing. And when I went to Gladesville, one thing I noticed compared to Rozelle back in the late 70s, early 80s, is that Gladesville had a greater sense of community within the hospital. There was a lot more movement of staff and patients around the grounds of the hospital, going to and doing different things, and people said hello to one another. There was a lot of interaction. So there was a kind of, as Tina was saying, a community within the hospital. And I think that was one of the disasters with the deinstitutionalisation, that there wasn't enough attention paid to how do we move the good aspects of community that existed within the institution into the wider community. What often happened is that people who had connections and had lived together or had been in the hospital for many, many years, sometimes 10, 20, 30, 50 years or longer, which was their home, they were then sometimes placed in places or locations where they had no connection with anybody, no connection with any community. So I think that it wasn't done well. And since then I've continued in different ways to work with in various community settings and community development, collaborative development things, both in Sydney and Brisbane, and working with people and trying to create, I suppose, community where there was or is little community, which I did partially in East Sydney, where I used to run a group for a time called Madness on, I forget what it was called there, but when I ran the same group in Brisbane, I called it Madness on Mondays, which included people, anybody who was interested, people with lived experience of mental health issues, as well as family and friends, and anybody, just people coming together and talking together, being mutually supportive, developing community and connections between people. And also when I worked with the Mental Health Association in Queensland in terms of assisting them with the redevelopment of their peer advocacy program. So it was peer advocacy rather than advocacy by professionals as such. So various things like that. Does that partly answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's great. We're going to have to draw it to a close. Sorry, Graham, I warned you I'd have to be a bit rude and butt in occasionally.
Do we have time for a quick question?
Yeah, we have. I'm just sorry, everybody. I'm just going to let you know we will draw to a close soon because we've got time constraints, and I apologise because there's so much to talk about.
I've got a really good question for Bettina and Graham. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and create the the ideal community health / mental health, or some other program, what would it look like?
Yeah, briefly.
Raise hand.
Mars. Mars.
Me first, okay. It would be for the whole of the world and for the whole of nature and creation, and it would be ecological, it would be spiritual, it would be really honouring and valuing and listening to all the First Nations peoples of the world, and recognising the mutual humanity and equality and diversity and beauty of all human beings and all the creatures of the earth and everything that is here. That's my short answer.
It's very ambitious.
Okay, I'm just going to have one word because we have to go. Okay, if I had to choose one word, it would have to be connectedness.
I think that's a really great question and a lovely way to finish. I know that there's so much more to unpack here, but we did start by talking about connectedness, and you talked about the whole person, and Graham opened with a really nice reflection about that kind of all of worldview, and you've entered there as well, Graham, in terms of mental health and well-being. So I'd like to thank our two guests tonight and I'd particularly like to thank Samantha Baker, who has done enormous work tonight. Thank you to our library. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Could I also make one last comment?
Yes.
I think that if anybody does have further questions or ideas, it would be great if they could be communicated to the project, that we could make summaries there. So if there are questions that you go away and maybe didn't get a chance to ask or think about later on, I think it's good for the ongoing connectedness to have your input or the input of friends or colleagues or that weren't able to be here tonight as well.
That's
so is there a way of doing that through the project?
Yep, I was getting to that too. So Professor Hans Foss couldn't be here tonight, but he organised this event. He's unwell, so he's staying away with his flu. But he is the contact point, and we will follow up with anyone who registered. We were able to do that through the event. It was Eventbrite. You can do that. Thank you very much. It's wonderful. So if you would like to stay in touch, some of you already are in touch with our project.
Also our website.
And our website, we have Thank You Eloise. I should thank Eloise as well, of course, as part of the project, but we have a website which is minding madness, or
Reminding history.
Reminding histories, thank you.
It
I
should
knew
be
that.
on the event. I think it might say like
Yes.
co-organised with us, and then just
Okay.
Google that. And it should come up.
There's also a Facebook page that we promote a lot of different things through, including events and news stories of note. But yeah, look, it's ongoing, and of course Martina and Graham were both interviewed for the project, and there's an interview sitting there being transcribed and for later use, and will depend on you both how that's used. But I think there's lots of interviews. There's almost 90 interviews this project has conducted now. So if anyone is interested, please get in touch.
Can you just say what the project's called again, because I was a bit late coming in?
That's okay, yeah. It's an Australian Research Council funded project at the University of Sydney.
Yeah, but what's it called?
It's called Australian Community Psychiatry 1960 to 1980, I think that's right. So,
Okay.
yeah.
But we just style it as reminding history.
Reminding
histories, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much everybody for coming along on this cold, watery, wintry night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks